This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 475th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I've spoken many times about how my preferred routine is to spend 2 hours a day on my fiction writing. This week, someone emailed me wondering why I'd settled on just 2 hours. It's a good question, and the answer is necessarily subjective to my own experiences and preferences. Mostly, it has to do with time constraints. In a perfect world, I'd spend more time writing every day, but there's just too much to do in a day and too little time in which to do it. Even though I'm a full-time writer, quote unquote, much of my time is still taken up by other concerns, including the business end of writing, daily email and social media, weekly responsibilities like this podcast, as well as more general stuff like bookkeeping and grocery shopping. But even aside from real-world time constraints, I will say that I do find 2 hours to be a nice time slot. It's long enough to really settle in and get some work done, but not so long that it feels formidable to tackle. Maybe it's partly that I haven't developed a habit for writing in longer swaths of time, but I do notice that I tend to be more distractible if I feel I have plenty of time. For me, 2 hours a day is long enough to get something done, but not so long that I don't feel the pressure to make sure I make good use of it. So, there you have it. And moving on, I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast, How to Tell If Your Story Has Too Much Plot and Not Enough Character. Can a story have too much plot? It might surprise you, especially if you're a regular listener, but the answer is absolutely yes. Implicit in the question of too much plot is the idea that a story should have more of something else. Usually that something else is character. And this is where we find the well-entrenched battleground of plot versus character. It's unfortunate these two crucial ingredients of story are often presented as exclusive opposites, bitter rivals who can barely stand each other, because the discussion at the heart of plot versus character is much more nuanced. As you probably know, if you've spent any time listening to this podcast, I dislike the whole structure of the plot versus character discussion. Too often it's presented as a simplistic either-or paradigm that demands a clear winner. Either plot or character must be the undisputed monarch of story. Ultimately, what that argument is really about is a style of writing. Those arguing for more plot are usually arguing for more conventional, often genre fiction. Those arguing for more character are usually arguing for more interior-oriented, often experimental literary fiction. That's a discussion for another day, but suffice it that both types of story almost inevitably require both plot and character. As we've discussed in many previous episodes, plot and character are less competitors and more symbiotes. Once you understand the self-generating cycle of character creating plot, creating character, creating plot, you understand that the two work optimally when they balance each other within the overall story form. But what happens when something is out of balance? What happens when your story has too much character or too much plot? It's actually really hard to do too much character. Usually if there's too much character development in a story, it's a sign not so much of character problems as it is self-indulgent writing in which the author counted too much on the readers loving the characters enough to watch them do nothing. When, however, characters are vibrant and well-drawn, they enter that beautiful cycle of creating plot. It's tough to write good characters without also writing plot of some sort. Even in more literary-leaning books, such as Charles Frazier's Cold Mountain, which are obviously preoccupied with character, the characters are vibrant enough to create a forward-moving plot out of even mundaneness, such as farm chores. It's also true that stories that are even more quote-unquote literary may spend their entire word count within the character's head, with little happening in the exterior world. Plot is admittedly thin in these stories. The authors have intentionally created a quote-unquote story that is more about the descriptive detail or philosophical thesis. Sometimes you'll see these devices woven into a larger, more obvious plot, such as in some of Thomas Mann's or Fyodor Dostoevsky's brooding asides. Pretty much, though, the only time you'll run into problems with a story having too much character is if those characters are either failing to generate plot and/or aren't entertaining enough to carry this story past scenes that are lacking in external conflict or momentum. Much, much more common than too much character development is the complaint of a story that has too much plot. Poor, maligned plot. It's always getting a bad rap. You'll hear comments like, that book was so plot heavy, or too much plot versus character, or that movie was nothing but stuff blowing up. But as it turns out, none of these problems are about plot. Rather, the problem is not enough character. Too much plot is almost always a sign the external conflict is operating on its own accord without being driven by dynamic characters. Stuff is happening, but the characters are just ciphers along for the ride. As a viewer or reader, I'm sure you can think of more than a few stories that fit the bill, and they're frustrating as all get out. The plot might be great. If it's a movie, the cast might be stellar. The theme might even be powerfully strong. But if the characters are just vapid automatons, the story feels empty. Recently, I watched several movies that checked all the above boxes. They could have been great, but they all stumbled and ended up just going through the motions, not because their plots were problematic, but because the characters just weren't there. Today we're going to look specifically at Netflix's recent army/heist flick, Triple Frontier, along with the Red Sea Diving Resort and Amazon's The Dressmaker, as a way of discovering what went wrong and how you can identify and rectify imbalances between plot and character in your own stories. And be forewarned, there are a couple spoilers for some of these movies as we go along. So here are 5 signs of cardboard characters. Sign number 1. The characters' personalities don't inform the plot. Ask yourself, why are your characters in your story? Why are these specific characters in this story? If there's no reason why this specific character is important to this story, you know you've got a problem. The surest symptom is an unmemorable character. Almost always, this lack of memorability is really a lack of specificity. It points to the fact that this character, his personality, his choices, his actions, are so bland and generalized that the character could be switched out for an alternate character. You might also recognize the problem if you realize the character's most important actions in the story could be undertaken just as easily by a different character. When this happens, you can be pretty sure you've got a character or two who's nothing more than an interchangeable part, a Lego guy who just needs a new head. For example, Triple Frontier has the sweet double advantage of a simple plot and a simple cast, just 5 main characters. But why 5? Why these 5? With the exception of Oscar Isaac's protagonist, most of the other characters have little to no development. In particular, Garrett Hedlund and Pablo Pascal are immediately forgettable. One's a boxer dumb enough to get his brains beat out every week. The other's a pilot dumb enough to get caught running drugs. That's pretty much the only specific contributions either make to the story. The Red Sea Diving Resort suffers exactly the same problem. Its protagonist is sketched pretty well, but almost all the supporting characters exist in the story with no more than one defining characteristic, none of which impact the story. We've got tough judo chick, vain beach dude, and stone cold assassin, but none of them are developed past their characteristic moments. Sign number 2. The story isn't about these characters. Ask yourself, do you know what your story is about? I mean, do you really know what your story is about? The easy answer is that stories are always about their characters. Events in a story exist only to develop character. Either specific characters generate specific events, or they react to events that were generated by other characters in specific ways. If not, if your story is peopled with characters so bland they can be replaced at a moment's notice, then you may end up with a story that ultimately doesn't mean anything. This is true no matter how great the premise or the action may be. For example, in the very first scene, Triple Frontier tells us what it's about, the negative effects of the warrior lifestyle. It opens with Charlie Hunnam's character talking to a group of soldiers about how his stint in Special Forces made it difficult for him to live without violence or in his post-army life in general. This through line is emphasized many times, culminating when the team's once respected leader, played by Ben Affleck, murders a farmer and is then retributively killed himself. But these developments never play organically, mostly because Affleck's character isn't well developed. His corruption arc plays out more like a crazy personality shift than it does an organic devolution as a result of his specific choices and actions within the story. Had the script allowed its character's development to generate the plot, rather than shoehorning their character twists into the plot beats, the story could easily have shifted into a compelling and thought-provoking thematic discussion. Sign number 3. The characters lack concrete and specific motivations. Often, the root cause of cardboard characters is a lack of concrete and specific motivations. What a character does in the plot is often much less important than why she does it. Monumental events can end up feeling bland when we don't understand what is personally at stake for characters. Even small, everyday events take on a new significance when we understand what motivates the character. Think of Liesel's reading in The Book Thief. Even if a character's motivations aren't explored in depth, if they are at least indicated early in the story, they will have the ability to inform the subtext. What might otherwise be a two-dimensional hero in an action flick can take on at least a semblance of depth. Think of Jason Bourne's deeply personal and existential motivations adding unspoken depth and meaning even to the straight-up race-em-chase-em of the third installment, Bourne Ultimatum. Now, Triple Frontier didn't totally bomb on this one. Viewers are given to understand that all 5 of the main characters have agreed to the central heist because of their problems in their post-military lives. We are given at least the hint of a specific personal reason for each character, even though only Isaac's and Affleck's motivations end up being pertinent. The Red Sea Diving Resort fares even worse in this regard. Only the protagonist, played by Chris Evans, is given a slight backstory with an explanation of his fanatical motivation for rescuing the Ethiopian refugees. His teammates aren't afforded even that. They're there because they're there, and that's that. Not only does this skip over what might have been a lot of compelling development, it also robs the film of the potential for much stronger interpersonal conflict than what we get from Alessandro Nivola's two-dimensional Doctor. Sign number 4. The first half of the story spends more time setting up the plot than it does the characters. If your story spends more time setting up the plot than it does the characters, that's almost always going to point to a disparity. Complicated plots are annoying and boring. Yep, you heard right. We don't like stories because the plots are complicated. To begin with, complicated plots usually don't work. Think about it. There is nothing simpler than a good whodunit. But more than that, complicated plots take time away from what audiences really do enjoy. And that's complex characters dealing with simple but difficult situations. These situations often seem complicated, but they're not. Good plots are as simple as presenting characters with a really difficult lose-lose or win-win choice. The mechanics of the choosing might be complicated, but the question itself is not. When this happens, a ton of story space is freed up for, you guessed it, character development. Most of that development should happen up front. If the characters aren't the most compelling thing about your story, then chances are audiences won't stick with it, or best case, they stick with it, but promptly forget about it. Now, neither Triple Frontier nor Red Sea Diving Resort were terrible in this aspect, but compare them to a classic action movie Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park balances plot and character just about perfectly. The entire first half of the story is spent on the characters and their reactions to the dilemma with which they've been presented. Dinosaurs are back. Is this a good thing or a very, very bad thing? No action whatsoever happens until the midpoint when the tropical storm unleashes the dinos. By then, the characters have been suitably developed so we care what happens to them and we understand why they make the choices they make. From the midpoint on, the plot can roar furiously to the forefront without seeming like it's too much. And sign number 5. Characters are specific, but exist only as shallow stereotypes to fulfill plot points. At this point, you might look at your cast and be relieved to discover all your characters have specific roles to play, they all have specific personalities and motivations, and none of their actions could be seamlessly handed over to another character. But there's one last problem to be aware of. Sometimes characters check all the above boxes and yet still exist not to generate plot, but to serve it. Almost always, this character emerges as a stereotype of some sort. Either a stereotyped character or a character whose development is forced to fit a formulaic plot. 2 of the most common culprits are antagonists, who are bad just because they're expected to be bad, and love interests, who fall in love with the protagonist just because they're expected to fall in love. But even protagonists can fall into this pit when they're heroic, just because they're expected to be heroic, or they end up winning the conflict just because they're expected to win. Be wary of characters going through the motions. Make sure there is a solid and compelling reason for a character's every action within the story. And just as importantly, make sure his arc is developed throughout the story. Whatever happens to him at the end must fulfill 2 requirements. Number 1, it must be properly set up in the story's beginning. And number 2, it must resonate thematically in the story's end. Most of the characters in Triple Frontier and Red Sea Diving Resort are so one-dimensional, they don't even risk this problem. A better example is found in The Dressmaker. Characterization in this film is excellent until the 3rd act, when everything falls apart to little thematic purpose. By far, the weakest character throughout is the protagonist's love interest, played by Liam Hemsworth. Throughout the story, he has little to do except fall in love with Kate Winslet, and little reason to do it except, why not? I do have a feeling this might have been better executed in the novel, which I have not read. Anyway, it doesn't become blatantly problematic until the 3rd plot point, when the character dies out of the blue, and the rest of the 3rd act fails to make his death a plot-generating catalyst. Rather, what it feels like is that the love interest character existed for no other reason than to shock both the protagonist and the audience with his death. The holy grail of good storytelling is great characters and a great plot. Learning to recognize the proper balance of plot and character is sometimes easiest when you first learn to understand what an imbalance looks like. If you can spot and correct instances where your plot is operating without enough input from your characters, you will be well on your way to writing exceptional stories. And tell me your opinion. Have you ever feared you've written a story with too much plot or too much character? If you'd like to be part of the fabulous word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast. And if you'd like to support Helping Writers Become Authors, I would totally appreciate it if you'd consider taking the time to leave a quick rating or review on the Apple site. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.